What if I told you
Are the coals lit
that in
yet?
one single year, fear spread faster than any army in Europe? Not because of a king, not because of a war, but because of something no one could see. Imagine waking up in the year 1347, completely unaware that within months, nearly half of your town might be gone. No warning alerts, no news headlines, just church bells, ringing more often than usual. And the strange thing is, at first, no one even understood what they were afraid of. Before we go any further, if you enjoy slow, thoughtful journeys into history like this, I'd love for you to join our little nighttime circle. You can gently tap that subscribe button, leave a like if the story speaks to you, or share where you're listening from. It always amazes me that these quiet stories travel farther than medieval trade ships ever could. Now settle in. Let the lights soften. Let the world slow down. And let's step carefully into Europe in 1347. Here is something most people forget. Europe was already exhausted. Just 3 decades earlier, between 1315 and 1317, the Great Famine had torn through northern Europe. Years of relentless rain destroyed crops. According to chroniclers like Jean Froissart, grain prices doubled and even tripled. Modern historians estimate that up to 10% of the population in some regions died from starvation. Imagine surviving that, only to face something worse. The climate itself had turned colder. Historians call this the beginning of the Little Ice Age. Shorter growing seasons meant fragile harvests. People lived closer to the edge than we do today. There was no supermarket safety net. If wheat failed, so did you. At the same time, war drained resources. The 100 Years' War had begun in 1337. England and France were locked in a struggle that would stretch across generations. Taxes increased. Young men marched away. Villages lost workers. Fear was already familiar, just not the kind that was coming. And yet daily life still moved forward. Florence bustled with bankers and wool merchants. Paris overflowed its medieval walls. London's population had reached perhaps 80,000 people, crowded, noisy, alive. Streets were narrow. Waste flowed in open gutters. Rats were not villains in stories yet. They were simply everywhere. Trade connected the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, to Asia, to the Silk Road. Genoese merchants traveled as far as the port of Kaffa on the Crimean Peninsula. Ships carried spices, silk, silver, and unknowingly something else. Most Europeans believed disease came from bad air, what they called miasma. If something smelled foul, it must be dangerous. In a way, they were not completely wrong, just not in the way they imagined. Here is the quiet irony. Europe in 1347 was more connected than ever before. Trade was booming, cities were growing, prosperity was rising. Connection made them strong. Connection would also make them vulnerable. No one standing on a sunny dock in Sicily that autumn could have guessed that a few ships drifting toward the harbor would change the course of European history. The year had felt ordinary until it did not. And in the next moment of our story, we will watch as the first whispers of something terrifying step off a ship and into a continent that is not ready. And then the ships arrived. In October of the year 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships drifted into the harbor of Messina, Sicily. At first glance, they looked like any other vessels returning from the Black Sea. But when townspeople approached, something felt wrong. Many of the sailors were already dead. Others staggered on deck, burning with fever, their skin marked by dark swellings, the size of eggs under their arms, along their necks and their groin. These painful lumps would later be called buboes. Contemporary chroniclers described them in horrified detail. The Italian writer Gabriele de Mussi wrote that the disease seemed to strike as if by arrows shot from heaven. Now pause for a moment. Imagine standing on that dock. Would you help the sailors? Or would you run? The people of Messina tried both. They ordered the ships to leave the harbor. But it was too late. Rats had already scurried ashore. Fleas had already found new hosts. The invisible had already begun its work. Within weeks, people in Messina were dying in large numbers. The disease did not move like a slow winter illness. It was fast, brutal. A healthy person could feel fever in the morning and be dead within 3 days. Some accounts suggest mortality rates in certain cities reached 50 or even 60%. And from Sicily, the plague followed trade routes like a shadow. It spread to Genoa and Venice. By early 1348, it had reached Marseille in France. Ships carried it westward along the Mediterranean coast. Merchants carried it inland. This was globalization medieval style. Modern scientists now believe the bacterium Yersinia pestis traveled primarily through fleas living on black rats, especially the species Rattus rattus. But in 1347, no one had microscopes. No one had germ theory. The word bacteria did not exist in their vocabulary. People searched for patterns. They blamed bad air. They burned fragrant herbs. Some believed planetary alignments in the year 1345 had poisoned the atmosphere. The medical faculty of the University of Paris even issued a report linking the plague to a rare conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. When you do not have answers, the mind creates them. Here is what makes this moment so powerful. The plague did not ask who you were. Merchant or monk. Noblewoman or baker. It moved through wealth and poverty alike, though crowded urban neighborhoods suffered the worst, and fear began to spread even faster than the disease itself. Church bells rang constantly for funerals. In some towns, there were too many bodies for proper burials. Mass graves were dug quickly. In Florence, Giovanni Boccaccio later wrote in the Decameron that people avoided one another, even family members. Imagine a world where a simple hug could feel like a death sentence. How would you react? Would you isolate, pray? Deny it was happening. As panic grew, communities began turning inward. Trust weakened. And when trust begins to crack, something far more dangerous than disease can emerge. Because what happened next was not only about sickness, it was about blame. As the graves filled and the church bells refused to rest, something even heavier settled over Europe. Suspicion. When people cannot fight what they do not understand, they often look for someone they can see. By the year 1348, whispers had begun circulating across parts of Switzerland, France, and the German states. Some claimed that Jewish communities had poisoned wells to destroy Christians. There was no evidence. Under torture, a few individuals confessed to impossible conspiracies. And that was enough. In February of 1349 in the city of Strasbourg, despite the fact that the plague had not yet even fully struck the city, nearly 2,000 Jewish men, women, and children were burned alive or expelled. Similar massacres occurred in Mainz, Cologne, and elsewhere. Historians estimate that hundreds of Jewish communities across Europe were destroyed during these years. It is uncomfortable to sit with this part of history, but it matters. Fear did not just kill through disease, it also killed through hatred. And yet, here is something that often surprises people. In some places, leaders tried to protect Jewish citizens. Pope Clement VI, writing from Avignon in 1348, issued papal bulls, stating clearly that Jews were not responsible for the plague. He even offered refuge within papal territories. But fear travels faster than reason. At the same time, another movement swept across parts of Germany and the Low Countries. Groups known as the Flagellants marched from town to town. They publicly whipped themselves, believing that dramatic acts of penance would persuade God to lift the plague. Chroniclers describe long processions, rhythmic chanting, and blood staining the streets. Can you imagine witnessing that column of strangers entering your town, beating themselves in public squares, insisting that divine anger was the true enemy? For many ordinary people, this felt like the only action they could take. When medicine fails, ritual feels powerful. Meanwhile, daily life fractured. In Florence, Boccaccio wrote that some people locked themselves inside their homes, living cautiously and eating moderately. Others did the opposite. They drank, sang, and partied wildly, believing life could end at any moment. Two completely different reactions to the same fear. Which one do you think you would choose? Isolation or reckless celebration? What makes this moment so human is that both responses still feel familiar. In times of crisis, some of us bake bread quietly at home. Others throw caution to the wind. The Black Death was not just a biological event. It was a psychological earthquake. Trust between neighbors cracked. Authority was questioned. Faith was tested. And as the plague continued its relentless march northward and westward, it began to do something even more unexpected. It started to change the balance of power in Europe itself. Because when nearly half of a workforce disappears, the world does not simply return to normal. It transforms. Now, here is the twist no one in 1347 could have predicted. After the terror came leverage. By the time the worst waves of the plague had passed through parts of Europe, somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the population was gone. In England alone, historians estimate the population fell from around 5 million to perhaps 2.5 or 3 million within a few years. Entire villages stood half empty. Fields went unplowed. Workshops had no apprentices, and suddenly labor was no longer cheap. If you were a surviving farm worker in 1349, you were no longer easily replaceable. Landowners who once dictated wages now faced a simple problem. Crops would rot without hands to harvest them. Wages began to rise naturally because demand was high and supply was painfully low. But those in power were not thrilled about this new reality. In 1351, the English government passed the Statute of Laborers. It attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and required workers to accept jobs when offered. In other words, we know you are rare now, but please pretend you are not. Do you see the irony? For centuries, peasants had been bound tightly within feudal obligations. Now the labor shortage gave them bargaining power. Some left their villages for better offers elsewhere. Some demanded higher pay. Some negotiated shorter terms of service. Not everywhere, not instantly. But cracks had formed in the old system. In parts of France and England, these tensions would later contribute to uprisings such as the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. While that rebellion had many causes, historians agree that the economic shifts following the plague played a role. The world had tilted. Even the church felt the strain. So many priests died while tending the sick that replacements were rushed into service, sometimes with less training. This weakened the authority and moral confidence of religious institutions in subtle but lasting ways. And then there was land. With fewer people, survivors inherited property. Some families suddenly found themselves owning more than they ever imagined. Consumption patterns changed. Diets improved in some regions because meat and dairy became more accessible per person. It is a strange thought, is it not? From unimaginable loss came opportunity for those who remained. This does not erase the grief, but it reminds us that history is rarely one-dimensional. Catastrophe and transformation often walk side by side. If you were alive, then watching your world collapse, would you have recognized that you were standing at the edge of social change? Or would it simply have felt like survival? Because beyond economics and power shifts, something deeper was changing too. The way people saw life and death would never be quite the same. And as Europe slowly stood back up on trembling legs, something else lingered in the air. Not the sickness this time, but memory. When death visits so frequently that it feels like a neighbor, it changes how people see the world. After the Black Death art across Europe took on a different tone, you begin to see skeletons dancing with kings and peasants alike in murals known as the Danse Macabre. The message was simple and unsettling. No status, no wealth, no title could negotiate with death. In churches from Paris to Lubeck, painters filled walls with vivid Last Judgment scenes. In literature, too, the mood shifted. Giovanni Boccaccio's The Decameron, written shortly after the plague swept through Florence, begins with a haunting description of deserted streets and silent houses. Yet inside that frame, young storytellers share humorous and romantic tales. Even in darkness, people still reached for laughter. Does that surprise you? That in one of the deadliest pandemics in recorded history, humans still told jokes. It feels almost rebellious, almost defiant. Historians estimate that between 75 million and 100 million people may have died across Europe, Asia, and North Africa during the mid-14th century waves of plague. In Europe alone, perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 of the population vanished within a few years. Those are numbers so large, they become abstract. But for individuals, it was not abstract. It was a missing chair at the table, an empty bed, a field no one plowed anymore. And yet, life did not end. Cities rebuilt, trade networks resumed, universities reopened. Within a century, Europe would enter the early stages of what we now call the Renaissance. Some scholars argue that the economic and social shifts caused by the plague helped create conditions for new thinking, new art, and new exploration. It is one of history's quiet paradoxes. Catastrophe can loosen old structures and make space for change. But here is the deeper question. When fear takes over a society, what lasts longer, the panic or the lessons? The year 1347 did not just bring disease. It revealed human vulnerability. It exposed prejudice. It challenged authority. It reshaped economies. It altered culture. And it left behind a simple, humbling truth: we are far less in control than we like to believe. And maybe that is why this story still echoes today. Because when we hear about ships arriving with something unseen, when we watch communities respond with courage, confusion, generosity, or blame, it feels strangely familiar. So as we close this chapter of our journey together, let us carry both parts of the story, the fear and the resilience, the mistakes and the transformations. Thank you for walking gently through one of the most pivotal years in European history. If this story gave you a new perspective or simply a quiet moment of reflection, I am grateful you were here. Stay close. There are many more nights in history waiting to be explored where humanity stands at the edge of uncertainty and decides what kind of future it will build. And yet, perhaps the most powerful part of this story is not how many died. It is how many continued. By the early 1500s, Europe's population had finally climbed back to pre-plague levels. That recovery took more than 150 years. Think about that for a moment. Entire generations were born, lived, and died in the shadow of an event that began in the year 1347. The plague did not disappear after a single wave. It returned again and again in smaller outbreaks for centuries. London would face another devastating epidemic in the year 1665. Venice built permanent plague hospitals known as lazarettos on isolated islands as early as the late 1400s, pioneering organized quarantine systems. In fact, the word quarantine comes from the Italian 40 giorni, meaning 40 days, the period ships were required to wait before entering port. Out of terror came public health innovation. Out of chaos came early forms of disease tracking. The Black Death forced cities to think differently about sanitation, isolation, and responsibility. Not perfectly, not instantly, but the seeds were planted. It also reshaped the imagination of Europe. Writers, artists, and philosophers carried an acute awareness of mortality. Some historians argue that this sharpened focus on the human experience contributed to the rise of humanism during the Renaissance. When you are constantly reminded that life is fragile, you begin to ask deeper questions about meaning, purpose, and legacy. What would you create if you truly understood how short life could be? The year 1347 was not just about disease. It was about exposure. It exposed inequality. It exposed superstition. It exposed courage. It exposed cruelty. It showed how quickly fear can fracture communities and how slowly trust must be rebuilt. And here is something quietly hopeful. Despite everything, Europe did not collapse into permanent darkness. Trade networks reconnected continents. Universities expanded knowledge. Art flourished. Scientific inquiry slowly, painfully advanced. Humanity stumbled forward. Fear took over Europe in 1347, but it did not win forever. And maybe that is why this story still matters. Because every era believes its crisis is unprecedented. Every generation feels the ground shake beneath its feet at some point. Yet history whispers a steady reminder: societies bend, they break, they grieve, and then they rebuild. If you had lived in a small town in 1347 watching ships arrive and bells toll without pause, you might have believed the world was ending. Instead, the world was changing. Thank you for spending this quiet time exploring one of the most transformative years in European history. If this journey helped you see the Black Death not just as a tragedy, but as a turning point, I am truly glad you were here. And if you are curious about the next moment when history stood on the edge of uncertainty, stay close. Another story is waiting for us, and I cannot wait to step into it with you.